Hello, Professor Ho, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here with us. It's such a great honor to have you in our newsroom. So many of our audience actually learned the name Jennifer Ho from director Yi Chen's new documentary, First Vote. And for those of our audience who haven't seen the documentary yet, can I just first invite you to introduce yourself a little bit, who you are, what you do, what are some of the current projects you're working on?
Sure. So for anyone who watched First Vote, they will know me as a professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Since that film was released, I've actually moved and taken on a new position. So I'm now currently a professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, which is where I live, in Boulder County in Colorado. And I moved here so that I could become the director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts. So I'm still a professor. I still teach. In fact, I'm teaching a critical race theory seminar this afternoon. But my main duties on campus right now are to direct and lead our Arts and Humanities Center.
I see. So I heard the term critical race theory so many times. Can you just introduce us to the idea a little bit more? What is it about and why is it important?
Sure. I think especially given the amount of misinformation that we saw coming out of the former Trump administration White House about critical race theory, it's really important that people get clear about what critical race theory is and isn't. So critical race theory is an academic discipline. It is an academic discipline like the study of law, like the study of math, like the study of biology. In other words, there is a body of knowledge, there is scholarship and research that critical race theory has contributed to, and that has led scholars such as myself to write books and articles and to teach classes on this subject. So critical race theory is not a political movement. Critical race theory is not an ideology that indoctrinates people. Critical race theory, so when people say, or when you hear things like critical race theory is infecting the federal government, that's like saying that the English language is infecting the federal government. Right? If we're thinking about the English language as a subject, or that's like saying that you can find physics all over the White House. So I hope that helps. I mean, the critical race theory and the critical part I think is especially important is to examine critically, thoughtfully, in depth, the meanings of race and racism historically situated in the United States. You can apply critical race theory to places outside of the United States, of course, and people have. But critical race theory was born out of critical legal studies in a US context specifically. So its roots are very much in the United States.
So, if I'm a person on the right, I might say, okay, so that's just liberal propaganda. So what's your response to that if you get called that name?
I think that things have gone so far off the rails of reality that I don't even know how I would respond to someone telling me that that's liberal propaganda, because that is essentially like telling someone who studies biology that that's liberal propaganda, right? I'm a professor. I have spent years getting my doctorate, writing books, researching, studying, as have other critical race scholars. What we are doing is not propaganda. What we are doing is legitimate scholarship.
Right. Well, thank you for that answer. So when I watched the documentary, I mean, I was like, I really want to be in Professor Ho's class because I have so many questions to ask her. And, the way you interact with your student is just fascinating to me. And the classroom is actually very diverse. That's an atmosphere that's really conducive to meaningful discussion. So my first question is actually on something that's very saddening to many of us in the Asian American community. The United States is experiencing another wave of anti-Asian American violence. And what's surprising, or perhaps unsurprising, is this UN report that just came out, actually pinpointing the former President Trump as a major driver behind some of the bigotry and also prejudice and discrimination. And a specific term that was especially problematic seems to be this use of China virus or Chinese virus to refer to the coronavirus. So can you first explain to us why is it problematic to call the coronavirus China virus or Chinese virus, and how is the term related to the history of anti-Asian American racism in the United States?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that question. So one of the things that I did when I started to hear that former President Trump and other members of the Republican Party were, and actually just anyone, was using the phrase China virus, Chinese virus, Wuhan flu, or I think the more obviously racist Kung flu. So I think for the average person who was using it, I was making the assumption, I was being generous and making the assumption that they may not have understood that what they were engaging in was a form of racism, right? Through calling the virus these various names, connecting it to China. Because whenever former President Trump or members of the GOP said phrases like Kung flu, China virus, what immediately followed was blaming China for the virus and not taking responsibility for a more robust federal government response to combat COVID-19. So the first place that we really have to start is with the World Health Organization. The WHO in 2016 said that they were no longer going to name new diseases by either geographic location or ethnicity, because they recognize that in doing so in the past, they have created ethnic and racial stigmas and national stigmas that have in some cases been more harmful than the disease itself. So I think the first thing I would just say is that we all want to be called by the names that we want to be called, right? We all want to be called by names that are either official names, legal names, or names that we have chosen. I know we're talking about a virus, so we're not talking about something that has agency or that has life, but the World Health Organization was very clear and very thorough in why they did not want to connect COVID-19 with the name of where it was first discovered, Wuhan, China. And the rhetoric that the White House, the former White House used in calling it China virus, Chinese virus, or the more obvious Kung flu, is part and parcel of a history of yellow peril rhetoric. In other words, from the moment that the first waves of Asians came into the United States, and that was in the 19th century with the wave of Chinese immigrants coming in search of gold, along with other immigrants from around the world, what immediately followed was this vilification of Chinese and Asians as being different. And that difference was marked as negative. So one of the things I did, and if you see, I have my Twitter handle here at Dr. Jen Ho, is I created a PowerPoint presentation to answer this question about why saying the phrase Chinese virus was engaging in racism and why people should call it COVID-19. Because the yellow peril rhetoric and the calling of the virus, Chinese virus, simultaneously with calling out China and blaming China has led to exponential increases in anti-Chinese, anti-Asian violence in the United States and around the world. So literally people have shown, and there are studies now that can back this up, Mike Pompeo goes on the news, talks about the China virus, blames China. The next day there is a spike in anti-Asian harassment and violence.
I also wanted to, I think in the documentary, you had this discussion with your students on the experience of race, comparing Asian Americans to Blacks' experience. And I find that discussion super interesting. So I wanted to unpack that topic a little more here. As we iterated previously during the email thread, I remember Frank Chen once wrote, "Whites love us Asians because we are not Black." And, even in today's media, we see this portrayal of Asian Americans as a model minority. We worked hard, we focused on education, we maintained stable two-parent households, and that's why we succeed. And the sort of undertone of that is, for some other racial groups, you are not as successful as Asian Americans because you don't work hard. You are from single parent households and you don't focus enough on education. So why is this idea of model minority problematic, and how would you compare Asian Americans' experience versus Blacks' experience in contemporary United States?
Yeah, no, that is a really excellent question. So in terms of answering the specific question of comparing Asian American experiences and Black American experiences, I think the most important thing to note about both are that neither Asians nor Black are white. And that's going to seem really obvious, but that was not always obvious, and that was not always a given. The idea of how our contemporary understandings of racial identities have come about were always in process. I would say maybe with the exception of white Americans always being at the top and Black Americans always being at the bottom. So one of the crucial ways that Asian Americans differ from Black Americans is that they have not been subject to centuries of anti-Black racism and discrimination and violence. So while it is true that there were Chinese miners in the 19th century who were lynched, and there's a great number of documented lynchings of Chinese as well as Mexicans in the American West of the 19th century, lynching is predominantly associated with Black Americans because in terms of both raw numbers, but more importantly, in terms of using lynching as a technology of power, right? Using the threat of lynching to try and determine behavior out of a Black populace. That was a technology that was used more for Black Americans by white Americans than it was any other group. Although again, anyone could be lynched, right? But I would say that as a technology of racism, it's really Black Americans who suffered at the hands of that particular technology. In terms of the model minority myth, I think the thing that is really important to understand also about the model minority myth is that it is a tool of white supremacy. So Asian Americans didn't invent this term for ourselves, right? It's not like, a bunch of Chinese and Japanese people got together and was like, boy, are we successful because we have two-parent households and because we learned English and we've been able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? It was a term created in the 1960s by a white journalist, and it was done as a way to praise Japanese Americans. And specifically, it was to say, hey, look, we locked up these Japanese in camps. Some of them couldn't even speak English. We let them out of camps, and they're working quietly, and they're not making a big fuss. And why can't Black people learn a lesson from the Japanese? Now, the fact that it's coming out in the 1960s, in the moment when there is a huge push for Black civil rights, is really telling, because the model minority myth is not meant to extol Asian Americans so much as it's meant to tell Black and Brown Americans, be more like the Asians, be quiet, shut up, don't cause problems, and then you can also succeed. So that's one hugely problematic thing that the model minority myth does. The other problem, of course, is that it's simply not true. In other words, all of us know of Asian American families that don't have two parents in it. And I will also say, right, the idea of like a two-parent household, I mean, that kind of language is also extremely heteronormative, right? Especially in the 21st century. So when you start to disaggregate data, right? So when we start to look and to see various ethnic groups and their rates of socioeconomic success, their rates of literacy, their rates of high school graduation, their rates of college graduation, what we notice by percentage of population is that Southeast Asians in particular suffer from the lowest literacy rates, suffer from the lowest socioeconomic rates, suffer from the lowest high school graduation rates. So it is also simply not true that all Asian Americans are model minorities, which is one of the reasons why, as much as I use terms like Asian American, I'm also really aware that everything is really localized and specific. It's just that things like racism don't take into account ethnic specificity, right?
Right, perfect. There's another sort of generational divide that I think is really interesting, which is this divide between first generation immigrants versus second or third generation immigrants. So I mostly interact with Chinese Americans. And the thing I notice is that for many first generation Asian Americans, especially the generation that came to the United States in the end of the 80s or the early 90s, they seem to have this strong tendency. They buy into a lot of the rhetoric by the Trump administration and by people on the right. I mean, they want to be anti-communism. They are pro-gun. But their kids, people of my age, are much more liberal. They believe in welfare. They believe in, all those things that their parents seem to be associating with socialism or communism. Is that something that you notice in your study, this generational divide between first generation and second generation immigrants?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, I'm a cultural critic and not a sociologist or an anthropologist. In other words, I don't go out and interview people or look at data sets to think about emerging patterns in the way that you've described, although I know others who have. Anecdotally, I will say that this is definitely something that I have heard, right? I don't know if it's actually born out of real data. So in other words, taking just Chinese Americans as a subset and directly answering your question about a Chinese immigrant post-1965 generation versus a 1.5 or second generation Chinese American. I think what's largely true is that children in general tend to be more liberal and progressive than their parents, whatever their ethnic or immigrant background is, right? So any American-born generation, regardless of ethnicity, tends to be more progressive in their thoughts and their politics than their parents' generation, from wherever they're from. One of the things I find really curious is because I've also heard both from people who study these populations as well as from some Chinese Americans themselves, like in the documentary that Yi Chen made about, Republican Chinese Americans and, Democrat Chinese Americans. So I do know, and this is something similar in the Vietnamese American community, that a lot of immigrant-born refugees and those from China who are against communism, who've suffered under communism, right? And I want to also put out there that as an American-born person, I don't know what it's like to have lived under a communist regime or to suffer under communism. The Republican Party has done a really good job of creating a rhetoric in which they point themselves as the party of freedom and they are anti-communist. But I also don't know that we have a really clear understanding of what these terms mean, right? Communism as a political and economic system and what being anti-communist actually means versus what's happening in practice, right? Same thing with socialism. We hear all sorts of things about like the ills of socialism. But I'm not exactly sure when people say that, what they're relying on. I think in some ways they're relying on memory and trauma and the pain of what it meant to live under a communist socialist regime. Again, whether that's Russia, whether that's Cuba, whether that's Vietnam, whether that's China. I also think that the really strange thing about, I will say, the two other Republicans who were featured, and I happened to speak with them because they came and did a talk back when my center at University of Colorado Boulder did a screening of First Vote. And in particular, Lance was so dogmatic, in my opinion, right? So single-minded in his drive and his zeal to paint the Democrats in a particular light, to use a certain kind of language and rhetoric that didn't allow for any kind of nuance, that didn't allow for any kind of complexity, that didn't allow for anything that was separate from the talking points that he had absorbed from the Republican Party. And again, I'm not an expert on China, I'm not an expert on communism, but what strikes me as being particularly ironic is the way that Lance and others like him are using a kind of dogmatic rhetoric that I associate with the worst of Chinese communism, right? A kind of party ideology that doesn't allow for difference or complexity or nuance, that has to be binary. And so while Lance and others like him are saying that they are against the Democrats or against or for Trump because he is against communism, what they're actually doing rhetorically is engaging in the same kind of propaganda that they didn't like when they were in China of the Communist Party. So there's a real irony going on, right? Where they are using the same tools, the same language, the same rhetoric of dogma and propaganda in saying that they are anti-communist that are exactly in keeping with the Chinese Communist Party rhetoric.
But sadly, propaganda works. And, it's especially saddening to me that many people I would otherwise consider as, people I respect sort of buy into that rhetoric so much that, at some point, I just don't know if I should ever talk to those people ever again. But, most people I think are not that black and white. There's some nuance and there's some space for a conversation. So my final question for today really is for those of us who are interested in learning more about anti-Asian American racism, and also who are interested in talking about racism to our parents, to our friends, to our first-generation immigrants, relatives. What should we do? And even where should we start? What are some of your tips that you can give us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I gestured to my Twitter account, but maybe didn't explain why people should go to Twitter. It's not necessarily to follow me, although that would be fine. But I have a pinned tweet. And if you're not familiar with Twitter, it's totally okay. It's basically just a tweet that's the first one that you'll find when you go to my homepage. And you can fill out a Google form, and I will email you a slide deck of the anti-Asian racism PowerPoint that I created. And it's a PowerPoint that has lots of hyperlinks to this, pretty much everything that I've spoken about today, right? This history of anti-Asian racism, yellow peril rhetoric, why saying China virus is racist, this history of anti-Black, anti-Asian racism that is linked to white supremacy. And then in the last two slides, there are a page of resources, right? Like what can you do if you're interested in wanting to fight anti-Asian racism? And so here's the thing, none of this is easy. So I wish I could tell people, if you just did this one thing, then that will help end racism. And unfortunately, it's not one thing that you can do in one moment. It's actually a series of things that you continuously have to do over time. And so one of the first things to do is to learn about the history of race and racism in the United States. And if you are someone who identifies as Chinese American or Asian American, I would definitely recommend learning about the history of Chinese and Asians in the US. And then understand how Chinese and Asians as a non-white racial group are contextualized with other racial groups like Black Americans, Latinx people, Indigenous Americans, as well as other kind of ethnic white Americans, Jewish Americans, et cetera, et cetera. As far as talking to family members, that's really hard, right? Because the truth is all of this is emotional, that I think there are fight and flight responses as human beings that we are attuned to when we have such strong political beliefs. So I'm not going to change Lance's mind, right? That was really clear when I talked to him privately on the phone, that he had a set agenda for whatever reason, right? That I'm not a psychologist, but if I were to kind of armchair psychoanalyze him, I would say it's probably rooted in some kind of trauma, right? Rooted in some kind of fear that probably happened when he was in China that has made his associations of communism so negative that he cannot look at anything that is going to disrupt that. So the truth is, while talking to family members is the hardest thing we can do, it's also something that is available to us. And I would say, you know, as honestly as possible to be able to sit down with a family member and say, here's what I believe. Here's why I believe what I believe. Here's why I think that your beliefs are harmful. Harmful for you, harmful for society. That's one starting point, right? To say to somebody like, I love you, and the things that you believe I think are harmful. I don't know if you're going to change their minds, but, you know, that is a starting point if you can get a wedge in. The other thing is that, you know, and I say this as a professor, everything I read, I try and read that is peer reviewed, right? So the things that I read on Wikipedia or on Twitter or on Facebook, like those are things that I take with a grain of salt. Those are people's opinions, and they can cite sources. Really, are their sources legitimate? Right? Are they talking in an echo chamber or in academia, right? If I'm going to publish an article, it has to go through several layers of review, several layers of people fact checking the things that I'm writing, right? So I think that's the other thing, like to make sure that people are looking at sources that are truly legitimate and that just aren't in an echo chamber.
I see. Those are very helpful tips. And I will also include the link to a slide deck you mentioned in the show notes section, and also add in some like Chinese version of summary so people can use that as a guide to read the slide decks better. But thank you so much for your insights. It's a great conversation. Thank you, Professor Ho. Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Bye. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.